This is Stanley Cupdate for June 8th, 2025. Neil and Vic here, and an extra off day for the Oilers and the Panthers.
This is definitely off with you opening the show, but your poise and your command of the microphone, truly admirable.
And the pause, which I have learned to do from my dogs because they've got 4 paws each.
I don't even know where to take that. So why don't we move forward and get this thing launched here? Extra off days, Neil had said, the Cup final with Game 3, 8 o'clock Monday on TNT with the final tied at 1 apiece. In our Stanley Cup final preview, we had spoken about systems and how Edmonton would want to be a little bit more wide open in skating and skill, and Florida play the game with a little bit more jam and along the wall. But like the Venn diagram, as I was taught in algebra, both had a little bit of what the other's specialty was. But I believe after watching the first 2 games of this final, neither team is going to dictate for an entire game. I think that we have seen these clubs play 9 games in the finals over the last 2 springs. There's no surprises here. It's going to be simply ebbs and flows.
It is. Last season was different. I think this season you've got 2 very experienced teams. Last season, Edmonton wasn't as experienced as Florida. You had Florida dictate a couple of those games. You're not going to get that this year, I don't think. I agree with you. And the composition of the teams are a little bit different. You've got 2 absolute mega superstars on Edmonton who are now very comfortable with playing in the final, in the NHL final. And you've got, of course, a whole group of players on the Florida side that are absolutely as comfortable as sitting on a couch playing in the final again this year. So I agree with you. I think the periods may change. We may see a difference in the tide going out and in period to period, but I don't think you'll get a whole 60 minutes being dictated by either side.
The first 2 games we saw similarities in first period, better by Edmonton. Second period, better by Florida. Carried into the third period, and then Edmonton was able to play with more pressure in the Florida zone later in third periods, both games going to overtime. At this point, it would not shock me any configuration of wins and losses over the last possible 5 games in the series.
You know, Vic, I didn't say it on the record on the show, but I said it to you and to Craig after our preview. I said, yeah, I'm picking Florida, but I don't know. I said nothing would surprise me. It could be 4 straight for either of them. It could be either of them winning 5. It could be either of them winning 6. It could be either of them winning 7. The only thing we know now is that neither of them are going to win in 4. That's all we really know.
Is that why people tune to the show?
I
for
think
math
so.
Like that?
Yeah, that's right. If you didn't, let me give you another one too that I've used with many people, and a stat that I find astounding. The first team to score in overtime wins 100% of the games.
What if it's a disallowed goal?
Well, then you haven't scored. So there.
Yeah, more great math from the great Smith.
From the Rain Man.
That's right. Do a little deeper dive here. Florida gets the last change here, but I think as a collective unit, I still like the depth of Florida's 12 forwards versus Edmonton's, although the Oilers do have that superstar quality. You've got the ability to certainly double shift McDavid or Draisaitl wherever you want. Also here, is this where maybe not having Zach Hyman starts to come into play a little bit more as this series goes on?
I think so. Kasperi Kapanen was burned in game 2 for a goal. He's played okay for them, and he's chipped in on the offense, but it's noticeable. If you have Kasperi Kapanen, who they picked up on waivers, in there instead of Zach Hyman, that's a big difference. I'm not picking on Kapanen. I'm just trying to say that their bottom three are not going to be as good as they could be if you had a guy like Hyman in the lineup in the top six.
In that there really wasn't a feeling out process in really either of the first two games. I mean, we've had more goal scoring that we truly expected. That 10-minute thing of the Oilers having to get through to that second commercial timeout and kind of settle the crowd in, I believe it's pretty overrated at this point because, again, as we've stated just before, there's no surprises here. I would expect Game 3 to come out exactly the same way as the first two games.
I would be surprised if it wasn't. Look, both these games could have ended in regulation, didn't have to go to overtime, but good on Corey Perry for tying that one up the other night and so on. I mean, will we get a third straight overtime? Doubtful, right? Because the math isn't there. And believe me, you're talking to the Rain Man about math. The math isn't there for them to go three straight overtimes. But you're going to get a close game again, I think. I'd be stunned if you didn't have a close game in Game 3.
Well, let's get into the overtime piece and the toll that this may or may not take on these clubs. That there was only one 7-game series in the 6 that these teams played leading up to the final, and that was in the second round where Florida took out Toronto. But the clubs have played 47 minutes and 33 seconds of overtime in the first two games. So that's 2 periods plus of extra hockey that they've already played in this series. Now, there are 2 days off in between games 2 and 3, and again in games 3 and 4. So is the fatigue factor overrated at this point? Because these athletes are in shape like we've never seen before in the history of the league.
Yeah, they are in fantastic shape. The only thing is that bumps and bruises will feel a lot better with an extra day off. That's for certain. I'm not sure that if a guy has no injuries and he's totally healthy, which most of them aren't, that the extra day will mean a whole heck of a lot. But both teams did travel on Saturday. Neither one went after the game on Friday. They both chartered and took that over 5-hour flight, even with the tailwind, which you get going west to east. It's still over 5 hours in the air. And when you put together what that means from when you leave your house or hotel, wherever they were staying, to the time that you walk into the hotel or house in the other end, you're probably talking about 7 or 8 hours of a commute to get to the new place.
And this is going to play a lot differently later in the week because between games 4 and 5, and we already know that there's going to be a 5th game, Smith math, that there's only 1 day off in between 4 and 5, which is atypical because there's usually 2 days off on travel situations. So you could see teams leaving right after game 4, could you not?
Yes, you could. You might see one of them do that and sleep in the air. And particularly when you're going in this direction, because you're going to leave, let's say you left at, just to pick a time, midnight after game number 4, and it takes you 5-hour flight, you're going to get in at 3 a.m. You're not getting in at 5 a.m. You're getting in at 3 a.m. So that's a lot different. You won't get on the ice in that day off at all if you wait to take the flight the next day. I'm sure this is already worked out on what they think they're going to do, because there's a lot of planning to get a charter flight ready and all that stuff. So I would think, though, that one of them, and probably Edmonton,
I agree,
will want to get back as soon as they can and get rested.
And that would be after game 4 on Thursday. Game 5 would take place on Saturday night. Do you see anything objective-wise that we haven't seen already that either Chris Knobloch or Paul Maurice would like to see happen in an optimum situation on Monday?
I don't really. I'm seeing some things that I am really taking note of, like the play of Nate Schmidt that's been just remarkable in my mind, and also the fact that when you look at the Florida defense, how well it's playing, and yet it's been overhauled from last year. It's a total, I mean, not totally different, but yes, Ekblad is still there, but there's a lot of different guys all contributing than were there last year. Ekman Larsson is in Toronto. Brandon Montour is not there, who had a huge impact, I thought, last year in the final. And so their defense has really been overhauled. But again, Zito's pushed all the right buttons every time he does things. It seems like he gets the right guys in, and Paul Maurice motivates them in the right way. And you know, this is not the exact same team. This is not the Oilers and the Islanders playing each other in 1983 and then again in 1984, where basically it was the exact same teams playing each other. The basis of the team is there, but it's not the exact same team.
So going back to the question that I had asked was, do you see the change in venue here affecting anything in terms of what these coaches want to see at the outset in Game 3?
The only thing I can see it changing is that Barkov and McDavid will be dance partners all night, because there's no way that you're going to get McDavid away from Barkov with Paul Maurice having the last change.
Since this is an off day, want to go a little bit different direction here, and we certainly made mention of Brad Marchand and Corey Perry in our preview. We spoke of them again with their heroics after Game 2. And this was something that I had brought up when we first launched this podcast a year ago about Brad Marchand in particular being a potential Hall of Famer. And I think we all know about the antics and the suspensions and everything else that went on earlier in Marchand's career. But I want to talk about him and Corey Perry together. And do you see either or both of these players going to the Hall of Fame? And I'll get your opinion, then I'll substantiate it with some stats behind it.
I could see both of them going into the Hall of Fame, particularly Corey Perry, because he won MVP in the league. He's already won one Stanley Cup, albeit 18 years ago. If he wins a second Stanley Cup, I think there's no doubt. And with Marchand, he's already won a Stanley Cup. And, you know, if he wins another Stanley Cup, I think there'll be no doubt. It's a very interesting question. I don't think when you talk about Brad Marchand, you think Hall of Famer. But if he wins a Stanley Cup with Florida this year, after what he did in Game 2, you definitely might be talking about a Hall of Famer. Because remember that, Vic, and we don't talk about this, but all the awards that you see are based upon only the regular season. When they had the voting came out for the Jack Adams Award, Carberry clearly got the most votes. And some guy writes on Twitter, hello, Paul Maurice, 3 years in a row in the final. Well, that has nothing to do with it. It has to do with the regular season. You can't take that into consideration. So what can get and does get taken into consideration when you talk about Hockey Hall of Fame is your entire career, both regular season and playoffs. And so you think of these two guys, you think of big-time playoff players. And so that has to be taken into the calculation of whether or not they get that nomination.
Here are some numbers. Corey Perry, 1,392 career games, 448 career goals, and he's intending to play next season. So if he gets, let's say, 20 goals, you know, he'll be in that 470 range, 935 career points, 62 playoff goals, and as you said, won the Cup with Anaheim in 2007, 5 overtime playoff goals, same as Brad Marchand, that is tied for third all-time behind Joe Sakic, who has 8, Maurice Richard has 6, and those two players are among 5 that have 5 overtime goals in the playoffs. Marchand, 1,100 career games, 424 goals, 980 career points, a plus 285, and he's got 63 goals and 155 points, and of course, won the Cup with the Bruins in 2011. And the two players combined have appeared in 10 Stanley Cup finals. Perry 6, and Marchand, this is his 4th.
Yeah, so I think you've just run through all the justification that they should be, at least thought of, nominated, and the committee will decide on that particular year whether they get in or not. But I would be surprised if at some point both of these guys aren't in the Hall of Fame.
I think both of us should now be part of that committee.
Yes, we should. The Rain Man and the Brain Man.
Yes. Where do we find that? All right. So once again, Game 3, Monday, 8 o'clock Eastern on TNT. No real news to report on other than the fact that the lone head coaching opening is now in Dallas, where Jim Nill fired Peter DeBoer late in the week. Went back and saw an interesting piece in the Dallas Morning News about the history of Jim Nill's hirings as head coach, and this will now be the 6th head coach that he will hire. He hired Lindy Ruff in 2013 after not renewing Glenn Gullitson's third-year option. Gullitzson is actually one of the assistants to Chris Knobloch right now. He hired Ken Hitchcock in 2017. Hitchcock led Dallas to their lone Stanley Cup in 1999. In 2018, just a year after, Jim Montgomery was brought on, and he came out of the University of Denver. And we'll get to why that's interesting in just a second. A year later, Rick Bowness was brought in after Montgomery was dismissed. 3 years after that, Peter DeBoer. And now we have another opening. And one of the sexy names that are out there is David Carl. Oh, by the way, from the University of Denver, where he has won the NCAA championships in 22 and 24. Montgomery was the third head coach brought on by Nill. This is the 6th opening. Do we see a pattern here? Or, as we'd spoken about on Friday, does Nill go for somebody more established, given that this team is close? This team is not in a rebuild. So I believe that there is a very specific type of individual that Nill would be looking for to get this team to that next level that they weren't able to achieve under DeBoer.
And that's the thing. He wants them to get over the hump. And it's thought that Peter DeBoer can't get them over the hump, obviously. And so you're not going to turn to a college guy with no experience to get your team over the hump. The people that you would turn to are the people that you've watched get teams over humps. And they don't have to necessarily be that they've won the Stanley Cup, although that would be preferable. And it would also be preferable that they didn't win the Stanley Cup decades ago, that they won it within recent memory, or certainly got to the final. And there's 3 guys that I can think of right away. It won't be popular names because they've all going to be called retreads and all that. Somebody who's sitting out there in the Maritimes is Jerry Spud Gallant, who has got a good coaching resume in the NHL. You know, he coached in Columbus way, way back. He coached in Florida. He coached the Vegas Golden Knights to their trip to the final, their first year in the league, and lost, of course, to the Washington Capitals that year. Then he's coached the New York Rangers and had 2 100-point seasons, over 100-point seasons. The knock on Gallant is that he's a motivating coach for his players. The players love him. But when it comes down to being a bit more technical and when things get tough and what are you going to do, what game plan do you have, it's not there. That's what the knock is on Jerry Gallant. So maybe that's what Jim Nill would think also and think, well, that's not the right guy. The other guy, Peter Laviolette, who just got dismissed from the Rangers, who's basically been everywhere, but gone to the final with 3 different teams in Nashville, Philadelphia, and of course with the one that he won the cup with, Carolina, back in 2006. So he's sitting out there. So you've got those 2 guys that are veteran guys that I'm sure that Jim Nill will consider.
And also now Peter DeBoer is out there. And we spoke about this on Friday. I think this is a good piece to elaborate just a tad more on, is we've had coaching moves that had taken place in both Pittsburgh and Boston right before DeBoer was let go. And you have to think, had the firing taken place maybe 2, 3, 4 days before that, whether DeBoer would have been a candidate with either the Bruins or the Penguins.
And what about the Seattle Kraken? They hired Lane Lambert. They're not a rebuilding team at this point. Seattle is wanting to make the playoffs again, and they hired Lane Lambert, as we just said. So you've got to wonder, and here's another one. There's who's going to replace DeBoer, and then there's a question of where will DeBoer go? You say, well, there's only one opening. Well, the Doug Armstrong rule is if a really good coach and a difference maker comes on the market, you might want to turn in your coach and hire this guy. And there are several places around the league where Peter DeBoer has clearly a better coaching resume than their current head coach. I'll let the listeners figure out who those teams are on their own. But, I mean, it's clear. Pete DeBoer has a great coaching resume. This is a thing people don't understand. There's 32 teams in the league. Like, your job is to win as a GM, as a president. There's only so many coaches that you know for sure know how to coach in the NHL. And so that's why they keep turning up. You got John Tortorella out there, by the way, who's been with good teams and won the Cup. He's been with rebuilding teams in his last stint with the Philadelphia Flyers. He seems to be able to do it in both situations. I guess the one blemish on John's resume is the Vancouver year that he had where things didn't go his way. That's funny because the two teams, Vancouver and New York Rangers, traded coaches almost because Vigneault came from Vancouver to coach the Rangers. Tortorella went from the Rangers to coach Vancouver. It worked out a little bit better for the Rangers with Vigneault than it did with Tortorella in Vancouver. But anyway, he's another name that's out there that has done it before. And then Peter DeBoer is sitting there. He's done a little bit of both in his time in the league. He's done a little bit of rebuilding and work with young guys. He's certainly had some senior teams that are ready to win. Hasn't been able to do it, but I don't know that it's all his fault. It's just he was the guy that was there when they weren't able to do it.
The Dallas situation certainly going to be top of mind as we carry on through the week and lead up to the end of the Stanley Cup Finals and then towards the draft and free agency. And now,
this day in Stanley Cup history, June 8th.
What a lovely dovetail here. And we're going to talk a little bit triple play. 2 games on this date in Stanley Cup history that went to triple overtime. In 2000, the Dallas Stars beat the New Jersey Devils 1-0 on a goal by Mike Modano. To stave off elimination, Ed Belfour made 48 saves to win the longest 1-0 game in final history. I was at that game, and that was one of those that felt it was going to go the entire night because the amount of chances that were being generated throughout the entire evening were few and far between. And this was the second of the 3 Devils Stanley Cup championships, right in that wheelhouse of their defensive style of play, even though Jacques Lemaire was not the head coach and Larry Robinson was. Robinson certainly took a lot of his cues from Lemaire in the defensive style that they learned under Scotty Bowman. That was a tough one to sit through.
Like watching paint dry?
Pretty close. Grass grow, to insert your line here. And then 2 years later on this date, the Detroit Red Wings beat the Carolina Hurricanes 3-2. Igor Larionov, the hero, scoring the tying goal with 1:14 left in regulation. And then at 14:47 of the third overtime at age 41, he became the oldest player to score a goal in the final. And to bring this full circle, who was the coach of the Carolina Hurricanes?
None other than the Florida Panthers, Paul Maurice.
Larionov, the oldest player to score a goal in the final, and Maurice, the youngest coach in the league, just 35 years old at that time when he was in that final.
He gets beaten by a guy 6 years older than him. It is remarkable. That's a great one.
There will be no show on Monday unless there is major news to break. And at that time, the executive board of NHL Wraparound will sit down and decide whether or not we will do a show. And also a change in traffic for Wraparound on Tuesday. Originally, we had Stan Fischler planned to join us. He will be unable to make it. However, we're going to be joined once again by Jack Michaels, who was on with Neil and I back in late March. And it's going to be interesting to revisit with Michaels because whether the Oilers win or lose Game 3, they're going to be in a better spot than they were in last year's final when they were down 3-0. But at that time that we interviewed Michaels, he was seeing things in this team that have manifested itself. So clearly the Oilers have come quite a way since that interview with Jack 2.5 months ago.
And Jack did tell me through text messaging that he picks the Oilers to win in 5.
What other genius picked the Oilers to win this series in 5?
I think the Brain Man.
Can't do any better than that. Folks, have a great day, and we'll speak with you again on Tuesday on NHL Wraparound.